The sun is going down now, slow and easy, the way it always has. I can see it from here, from this old wooden chair on the porch, settling itself behind the line of elm trees at the far edge of the south field. The light is turning that warm color, that amber and gold color that looks like honey poured across the tops of the corn, and the shadows are growing long and soft across the grass. There is a little wind tonight, just enough to move the leaves on the maple by the well, and I can hear them talking to one another in their quiet way. The chickens have mostly gone in. The barn is still, and I am sitting here, as I have sat here for more evenings than I can count, just breathing and watching and letting the day come to its close. I am an old man now. 83 years I have carried on this earth, and my hands show it. My knees show it, and some mornings my back reminds me of it too. But sitting here this evening, there is no pain that seems to matter much. There is only the cooling air and the sound of the crickets starting up, one by one, the way they always do when the light begins to fade, and there is a kind of peace that settles over everything at this hour that I have always loved. I have been thinking today about when I was young, about the farm where I was born and the fields my father worked and the smell of my mother's kitchen on cold winter mornings. These memories are very clear to me still, clearer sometimes than what I had for breakfast, which makes me smile a little. The old things have a way of staying. They become like the grain in good wood. The longer it dries, the more you can see the pattern. So let me tell it. Let me sit here in this evening air and tell it slowly, the way the old ones used to tell things, without hurry, without rushing toward any particular end. There is enough evening left, and I am in no hurry to go anywhere. I was born in the month of March, in the year 1902, in a farmhouse about 3 miles east of where I sit now. The house is still there. Josiah Baylor owns it now, has for many years, and he has kept it well. The same white paint on the clapboards, more or less, and the same wide porch facing west, and the same old oak tree in the yard that my grandfather planted before my father was born. That oak must be very old now. I think about it sometimes and wonder what it has seen. My father was Samuel Stoltzfus, and my mother was Rebecca, born a Yoder before she married. They had 8 children, and I was the 4th, arriving in the middle of winter's last long breath, just as the maple sap was beginning to think about moving again. My mother used to say I came in with the spring. She said it warmly, like it was a thing she was glad of, and I always believed her. The house I grew up in was not large by some standards, but it was well made. My grandfather had built the main part of it, and my father had added a room on the back side when the family grew. The floors were wide pine boards that had been scrubbed so many times they had a pale, smooth look to them, almost silvery in certain light. The walls were plain, as is our way, no pictures or decorations save for a small calendar in the kitchen and the almanac that hung by the back door. But the plainness of it was never cold. There were quilts on the beds, heavy and soft, stitched by my mother and my aunts and the women of the church. There were braided rugs on the kitchen floor. There was always a fire in the stove. The kitchen was the heart of the house. It was always warm, always fragrant with something, bread baking or soup moving slowly on the stove, or the deep sweet smell of apple butter being made in the big copper kettle. My mother was in that kitchen most of the day, it seemed, though she never appeared to hurry. She had a way of moving through her work that was steady and unhurried, like the movement of water in a broad, slow river. She hummed sometimes while she worked. Old hymn tunes mostly. The ones from the Ospund, our old hymnal, the songs that have no printed melody, but that every one of us learned by ear from those who came before. Outside the kitchen window, when I was small, I would watch my father moving across the yard in the early morning, heading to the barn in the gray light before sunrise. He wore his dark hat and his coat and his rubber boots on the wet mornings, and I could hear the sound of his boots on the frost-hardened ground, a soft crunching sound that I can still hear clearly if I close my eyes. He walked with purpose, but without haste. That was the way of it. Work to be done, yes, always, but no need to run toward it. The barn was my favorite place when I was a boy. I do not think this is unusual for boys who grow up on farms. There was something about the barn that felt right, that felt safe and enclosed and full of interesting things. It was large, our barn, built of stone on the lower level and wood above, the way they built them in those days in Lancaster County. The stone was a kind of gray-brown, and it had been there long enough that moss had taken to the north-facing corners, a soft green moss that was cool to the touch, even in summer. The wooden parts were painted red, as most barns were, and the paint was always a little faded, a little worn at the corners, which I always thought made it look more honest somehow. When you stepped inside the barn in the morning, the smell came first. It was the smell of hay and horses and warm animals breathing, and of the grain stored in the bins along the east wall, and underneath it, all something deeper, something like the earth itself, rich and dark. The horses would hear you come in and turn their heads, and some of them would make that soft sound in their throats, that low rumbling sound that horses make when they recognize someone they trust. My father's team was a pair of Belgian draft horses. Hank and Otto, both of them bay-colored, big and gentle and easy to work with. Hank was the calmer of the two. Otto could be a little particular in the morning, needed a few minutes to settle, but once he was settled he was as reliable as the sunrise. I learned to care for the horses very young. My father started me on it when I was perhaps 5 or 6 years old, giving me small tasks at first, carrying the water bucket, bringing the hay, standing nearby and watching while he harnessed them. The harness was a heavy, complicated thing, all leather and brass fittings, and my father knew every piece of it without thinking. His hands moved over the straps and buckles with a certainty that I admired very much. By the time I was 10, I could put the full harness on Otto myself, reaching up on my toes to get the collar over his head, managing the hames and the traces and the breeching. Otto would stand still for me by then. He knew me. There is something I want to say about the horses, about working with horses, that is hard to put into words, but that I will try. When you work all day beside an animal that large, an animal that is willing and patient and doing its share of the labor, something happens between you. It is not the same as working with a machine. A horse breathes. A horse gets tired. A horse notices things, the same bird in the same tree. 2 fields over, the smell of rain coming before you can smell it yourself. When you plow with a horse, you are not alone. When you drive a wagon with a horse, you are not alone. When you drive a wagon with a horse, you are in a kind of conversation, even if no words are spoken. You feel it through the reins. You feel it in the small adjustments the animal makes, and the small adjustments you make in response. After enough years of it, it becomes something close to a partnership, and that is not too grand a word for it. My father drove us to church in a black buggy pulled by a single horse, a mare named Pearl, a dark gray horse with a black mane. She was lighter on her feet than the draft horses and very reliable on the road. The sound of Pearl's hooves on the road was a particular sound, unhurried and rhythmic, and the buggy would rock gently on the uneven road. And sometimes in summer the air smelled of hay and wildflowers, and sometimes in autumn it smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and sometimes in winter it smelled of nothing but cold and snow and the wool of our coats. We would load into the buggy on Sunday mornings, all of us dressed in our church clothes, my mother in her black dress and white cap, and my father in his dark coat and vest and his flat-brimmed hat, and we would set off down the gravel road toward wherever the service was being held that week. Church was held in homes and barns, rotating through the district, never in a dedicated building of its own. This is still the way. When it was our turn to host, my mother spent days preparing, and the whole house would be cleaned from floor to ceiling, every window washed, every rug beaten, every surface scrubbed. The benches would be brought from wherever they had last been used, carried in the bench wagon, the long flat wagon that the district kept for this purpose, and they would be set up in the main rooms of the house or in the barn if the weather was warm enough and the congregation large enough. The services were long, 3 hours roughly, sometimes a little more. The singing came first, those old slow hymns from the Osbund that could last 10 or 15 minutes each, the melody unfolding in long unhurried notes, the congregation finding it together, voice by voice. I loved the singing even as a small child. There was something about all those voices finding the same note, finding the same pace, that felt to me like something very solid and real. Like the sound itself was a kind of shelter. The preaching was in Pennsylvania Dutch, our old language, the German dialect our people had brought with them from across the water, and I understood it as naturally as I understood the English I was learning in school. The preachers spoke plainly, without notes, the words coming to them as they were moved to speak, and sometimes the words were simple and quiet, and sometimes they were more urgent, but they never seemed to be performing for anyone. They were just men speaking what they believed, and that simplicity gave it weight. After the service there was the meal, always the community sitting down together to eat what the hosting family had prepared. There would be bread and soup and pickles and spread cheese and pie, nearly always pie, and coffee and meadow tea, and the children would eat at their own table and then go outside while the adults talked. Those Sunday afternoon hours, the men visiting in the yard, the women gathered in the kitchen, the children running in the fields, those hours had their own kind of ease that I have always remembered with fondness. There was no particular agenda. There was just the community being together. And that was enough. My mother was a fine baker, and her bread was something I took entirely for granted as a child, the way children take for granted the best things around them. It was only later, when I was grown and living on my own for a time before I married, that I understood what a particular skill it was and how much went into it. She baked on Thursdays mostly. She would start the bread in the evening, mixing the dough by hand in the big ceramic bowl that had been her mother's and leaving it to rise overnight covered with a clean cloth. She baked many loaves at once, 8 or 10 at a time, because the stove was large and because bread fed a family of 10, and the loaves would cool on the table, their crusts just golden, and we children were not supposed to touch them until they had cooled properly, but we would hover nearby, and sometimes my mother would cut the end off a loaf still warm and spread it with fresh butter, and that was one of the best things I've ever eaten in my life. In the morning she would punch it down and shape it and let it rise again, and then it went into the oven, and the smell of it baking was something that filled the whole house, warm and yeasty and sweet, in a way that is almost impossible to describe except to say that it smelled like home. It smelled exactly like home. The butter was made in our kitchen as well. This was something the older girls helped with, and sometimes I helped too, though I was not always patient enough for it. The cream was separated from the milk in the morning, and it sat until it had ripened a little, and then it went into the churn. The churn was a tall wooden thing with a handle and a dasher, and you worked the dasher up and down for a long time. It was not hard work, but it was steady work, and it went on for what felt like a very long while to a child. And then, after enough time, something changed in the sound and the feel of it, a sort of heaviness, a thickening, and soon the butter was forming, yellow and solid, and you could hear it sloshing differently in the churn. My mother would gather it and press it and work the buttermilk out of it, salting it lightly, and then pack it into a mold, with a wheat sheaf design pressed into the top. That butter on fresh bread was a kind of luxury we did not even recognize as luxury. It was simply what butter tasted like. The garden was my mother's great pride. It ran along the south side of the house, fenced in to keep the chickens and the occasional escaped pig out, and it was large, larger than it probably needed to be, but my mother believed in abundance, believed in having enough and thence believed in having enough and then some, and so she planted generously and expected generously in return. There were rows of beans, green and yellow both, and rows of peas in the spring, and onions and garlic and beets and turnips. There were several rows of sweet corn near the back. There were tomatoes staked along the fence, heavy with fruit in August. There were cucumbers climbing the same fence, and summer squash growing low and broad, and winter squash swelling on the ground in the far corner. The preservation of all this was a major undertaking that ran from July clear into September. The canning was done in the kitchen, with the stove going full and the room hot, steam rising from the big water bath canner, the smell of hot vinegar and spices and fruit filling the air. My mother canned beans, tomatoes, corn, pickles, applesauce, peaches, pears, peats, relishes. The shelves in the cellar at the end of summer were beautiful in their way. All those glass jars in rows, the colors of the vegetables and fruit showing through, dark red tomatoes and pale yellow beans and bright orange peaches and deep purple grape jam. When I went down to the cellar in the winter to fetch something my mother needed, I would stop and look at those shelves sometimes. They were a kind of abundance made visible, a whole summer's work standing there quiet and patient in the dark. Autumn was the harvest, and the harvest was everything. The whole rhythm of the farm year aimed itself at the harvest, all the planting and tending and waiting, and when it came with a fullness that demanded everything you had. My father and my older brothers worked from before sunup to after sundown during harvest, and the neighbors came to help and we went to help them in return, because no one family could bring in everything alone, not the corn, not the wheat, not the hay for the winter. This exchange of labor was as natural to us as breathing. You helped your neighbors because your neighbors would help you, and because it was right, and also because working together was better than working alone in every way that mattered. The corn was cut by hand in the early years of my childhood, though later my father acquired a corn binder pulled by horses, which was a great help. But I remember the hand cutting, the long rows of corn in September, the stalks thick and rustling, and the smell of them, that particular dry green smell of corn in autumn, and the sound of the knives working. The cut stalks were bound into shocks and set in the fields to dry, and they stood there in rows across the fields for weeks, looking like small tents, and in the early morning fog they were beautiful in a quiet way. The threshing came in summer, after the wheat was cut and dried. A threshing machine came around, pulled by horses, moving from farm to farm through the district, and the men followed it, the same group of neighbors working each farm in turn. The noise of the threshing machine was tremendous, a great clatter and roar that you could hear from a long way off, and the dust and chaff rose in clouds around it, and the men worked in the heat and the dust with their shirt sleeves rolled and the sweat running down their faces, and the women kept them fed, carrying food to the fields at midday. The dinner at threshing time was always particularly large and good, because so many men needed feeding and because it was a point of pride to feed them well. There would be roast chicken and mashed potatoes and several kinds of vegetables and bread and pies and cold meadow tea to drink, and the men would sit in the shade of whatever tree was nearby and eat with the appetite of men who had been working hard since early morning. I loved those threshing days, even as a child too young to do much useful work. I was allowed to be there, to carry water, to run errands, and to watch. The community of it, all those men working together in the same rhythm, the way they fell into the work naturally, each one knowing his role, it impressed itself on me very early as the way things ought to be. A man was not meant to stand alone. A man was meant to be part of something. The granary stood at the far end of the barn, a separate small building with thick walls to keep out the damp and the mice as much as possible. The wheat went in there after threshing, bushel upon bushel, and it had a smell I cannot compare to anything else, dry and dusty and full of something. Standing in the granary in summer with the new wheat just in was like standing in the middle of a year's work, and the weight of all those bags and bins had a satisfying solidity to it. I went to school from the age of 6 until I was 14, which was our way. The school was a one-room building about a mile from our farm, built of wood and painted white, with a small porch on the front where the children could leave their boots in wet weather, and a bell on the roof that the teacher rang in the morning. The teacher was often a young woman from the community, one of the older girls who had herself recently finished school, and sometimes it was a young man. In my time there were several different teachers, and they varied in temperament and in strictness, but they all taught the same things: reading and writing and arithmetic, some history and geography, the things a practical person would need. The classroom held perhaps 20 children of all ages, sitting at their wooden desks, the littlest ones in front and the bigger ones toward the back. The older children helped the younger ones sometimes, and that seemed right, seemed natural. The room smelled of chalk and of the lunches the children brought in their tin pails, and of the coal fire in the corner stove in winter. The windows were large to let in light, and on fine spring days the windows were opened and the smell of the outside came in, and it was difficult to keep one's attention on the arithmetic. Recess was 2 times a day, morning and afternoon, and in the play yard behind the school we ran races and played games. There was a game, something like baseball, that we played, with a rubber ball and a stick, and there were games of tag, and there was a rope swing hung from the old sycamore at the back of the yard. In winter, when there was snow, we made forts and threw snowballs, the children dividing themselves into opposing armies with great seriousness, and then retiring to the classroom laughing and red-faced and dripping. The teacher always made us hang our wet coats by the stove to dry before returning to our lessons. I was not a gifted student in the way of books, but I was not a poor one either. I could read well, and I liked reading when I could find things to read. We did not have many books at home beyond the Bible and a few religious books and the almanac, but the school had a small shelf of readers and geography books, and I read those through, and sometimes the teacher would bring in a book of her own for us to read aloud together. I remember a book of nature essays that one teacher brought, and the descriptions of birds and rivers and mountains in that book seemed to me very fine, though I could not have said exactly why at the time. The arithmetic I was fairly good at. Numbers made a kind of sense to me, the way they added and multiplied and divided with their reliable logic, and I think the farm work helped, because a farm is full of mathematics. How much seed for how many acres, how many bushels to fill a wagon, how many gallons a cow will give in a week. My father was good with numbers too, kept his accounts carefully in a small leather book, and I learned from watching him that precision in numbers was a form of honesty, a way of knowing clearly where you stood. The walk to school was 1 mile each way, and in fine weather it was pleasant enough. The 4 or 5 of us from neighboring farms walking the gravel road together, talking and kicking stones and stopping to look at things. A snake in the ditch, a hawk circling overhead, a particularly fine pumpkin in someone's field. In winter, when the road was packed with snow and the temperature dropped hard, the walk was less pleasant but still manageable, and we dressed for it, heavy coats and scarves and the knitted mittens our mothers made. I cannot recall ever missing school for weather, though I imagine there were extreme days when we did not go. The cold was simply part of the season, nothing to make a great deal of fuss about. Winters in those years were reliably cold in a way that settled in and stayed for months at a time. The fields went white in December and stayed white until March, and the cold had a particular quality to it on clear nights when the stars were very bright and the temperature dropped well below zero, a dry, still cold, a cold that did not move, that simply sat over everything like a vast and patient hand. On those nights the horses in the barn would need extra hay, and the water in the troughs would need breaking in the morning, and the breath of the animals would make small clouds in the lantern light when we went in to do the chores. But the winter had its comforts too, and I remember them as clearly as the cold. The feeling of coming in from the cold to a warm kitchen, the warmth hitting your face and your hands first, the smell of something on the stove, the way the cold air came off your coat as you hung it by the door. The evenings were long in winter, and after supper the family would sit together in the main room. My father would read from the Bible a portion each evening, reading slowly and deliberately in his deep voice, and we would listen. Afterward there might be some other reading, or my mother would sew or knit, and the older children did the same, and the younger ones played quietly on the floor or fell asleep there where they sat. The lamp on the table was a kerosene lamp, its flame yellow and warm and a little unsteady when the door opened and a breath of air reached it. By its light everything in the room had a soft, amber quality, the faces around it gentle-looking, the shadows deep in the corners. There is a quality to kerosene lamplight that is different from any other light I know. It is warm in a way that is physical, like the warmth of a living thing, not harsh or flat, and it threw its light in the circle that made the space it lit feel particular, feel enclosed and safe. Beyond the circle the rest of the house was dark, and outside the windows the winter night was dark, and inside the lamplight we were all together, and it was enough. I was perhaps 12 years old when I began working alongside my father and my older brothers at the serious farm work, the plowing, the planting, the haymaking. The plowing was the beginning of it each spring, and there was something about turning the soil in spring, the long furrows going brown and gleaming, the sharp smell of the turned earth, the particular effort of walking behind the plow hour after hour, steadying it, holding the lines to the horses. There was something in all of that which felt important beyond just the practical necessity of it. These are the years I think of when I think of learning what work is. Not the small tasks of childhood, carrying and fetching and tending, but the full days of hard labor that go from dark to dark. Like a kind of conversation with the earth. Like a beginning. Spring came slowly in those years, or so it seemed to a boy impatient for it. February was still deep winter, dark and cold, and March was uncertain, some days soft and warm and some days dropping back into ice and snow. But there were signs, always, small signs that you learned to read if you paid attention. The maple sap beginning to run, which we knew because my father and my uncle tapped several trees each year and boiled the sap in the yard over a wood fire, the steam rising in a sweet cloud. The first red-winged blackbirds returning to the fields, their call sharp and bright against the still gray sky. The light changing. This was the surest sign. The quality of the light in late February and early March turning different, longer and slightly warmer in its color, the sun reaching a little higher in the sky each day. When the real thaw came, the fields turned soft and dark and fragrant, and the smell of the warming earth was something we had been waiting for through all the long winter months. My father would go out and take a handful of soil and press it, testing whether it was ready to work, and the day he judged it ready was a kind of quiet celebration, not marked by any special thing, but felt by everyone. The horses were brought out and harnessed, and the plow went into the ground, and the year began again. Planting was done by hand in those early years of my life, or nearly so. My father walked the rows with a small dibble tool making holes in the prepared earth, and we children followed dropping seeds in and then covering them. Sweet corn, beans, pumpkins, and squash, rows of potatoes that were planted by cutting the seed potatoes into pieces each with an eye and pressing them into the earth. The potato field was a particular job I can still see clearly. My father and my brothers bent over the rows, the sky wide and blue above us, a red-tailed hawk circling somewhere to the north. The smell of the earth and the fresh green smell of the potato plants we were planting around, the dirt working itself under your fingernails no matter how careful you were, the satisfying thud of the hoe covering each planting. Hay season came in June, and it was the most beautiful of the farm seasons to my eyes, perhaps because I loved the smell of cut hay more than almost any other smell in the world. There's nothing quite like it, the smell of new-mown hay drying in the sun, sweet and grassy, and somehow also a little like honey. The warmth of the sun pulling the fragrance out of it. The hay loader would pick it from the windrows and carry it up into the wagon, and the men on the wagon would pack it, and the horses would pull the loaded wagon to the barn, and the hay would go up into the mow through the big overhead door at the peak of the barn, and you had to work fast to keep up with it, spreading and packing it into the mow so it laid correctly and would keep well. Recut the hay with a horse-drawn mower, the blade clicking steadily, laying the grass in long rows, and then it dried for 2 or 3 days, depending on the weather, being tedded and raked to help it dry, and then we gathered it. The gathering of hay was the work I loved best of all the farm work. The inside of the barn in haying time was golden with dust and fragrant beyond all words, and the heat of it was tremendous. The heat of the summer day added to the heat of the horses and the heat of the fermenting hay, and you would sweat through your shirt in the first hour and stay wet all day, and that was fine. That was the work. At noon, the women brought dinner to the fields, or the men came to the house, and there was a rest of perhaps an hour, eating in the shade of a tree or the cool of the barn, and then back to it, until the light began to fail. Those evenings after a long day of haying, sitting on the porch with supper done, too tired almost to move, the swallows flying their loops over the barn, the air beginning to cool, those evenings had a deep satisfaction in them that I have held on to all my life. The body's tiredness after a full day of honest work is not the same as any other kind of tiredness. It is a tiredness that has a bottom to it, a completeness, and sleep comes from it easily and deeply. I should say something about the summers, about the particular feeling of those long summer days in Pennsylvania. The heat could be heavy, really heavy in July and August, the air thick with humidity, the fields shimmering in the afternoon, the horses sweating in their collars. But there were also the summer thunderstorms, which I loved with my whole heart, even as a child. The air before the storm had a particular smell, something electric and green, and the birds would go quiet, and the horses would become restless in the barn, and then the wind would come first, bending the corn, and then the rain, hard and warm, drumming on the barn roof and on the tin roof of the spring house, and the lightning coming in great yellow sheets across the sky and the thunder following it, rolling and deep. They would build in the west in the late afternoon, those great towers of cloud, white at the top and dark at the base, and you could watch them coming for an hour before they arrived. We children loved to sit on the porch during those storms and watch them, if our parents allowed it, which they sometimes did. The rain coming in sheets across the fields, turning the lane into a small river, the smell of the wet earth rising up, the lightning splitting the sky, and then afterward the world washed clean, the air lighter and cooler, steam rising off the hot surfaces where the sun touched them, and a rainbow sometimes, a full rainbow across the eastern sky, its colors very clear after the rain. The nights in summer were their own pleasure. After the heat of the day, the evenings cooled gradually, and by bedtime there was usually a breeze coming from somewhere, coming through the windows of the bedroom, lifting the curtains gently, the sound of the summer night through the open window, the katydids and the tree frogs and the crickets, all going at once in a kind of continuous chorus that you stopped hearing after a while because it was so constant, but that was there all the same. A living sound, the sound of summer being alive in the dark. I have slept to that sound 10,000 times, and it has never failed to be peaceful. The years passed, as years do, each one much like the one before in its large pattern, but different in its particular days. I grew, as boys do, taller and stronger, and the work that had been my father's became more and more mine, the way it happens on a farm, gradually, without announcement. By the time I was 16, I was doing a man's share of the work without anyone saying so. That was simply how it was. At 16, I began my Rumspringa, the time our young people have to see something of the world outside our community before making their decision to be baptized. This is a time that is often misunderstood by those outside the Amish, I think, who imagine it as something more dramatic than it generally is. At least it was in my time. In those years, for me it was a period of some months when I was allowed more freedom, when I could attend some of the young people's social events, the singings and the Sunday night gatherings, and when the rules were a little loosened. I did not go far from home. I was not much inclined to. I had seen enough of the outside world on our trips to market and to town to know that it held things I did not particularly need or want. The singings were the best part of that time. The young people would gather on Sunday evenings, sometimes at one farm and sometimes at another, and we would sing for an hour or two before the older ones went home. The singing was done in English rather than in the Pennsylvania Dutch of the church services, faster and lighter hymns, and there was a liveliness to those evenings that was different from the gravity of church. Boys sat on one side of the room and girls on the other, and after the singing proper there was usually some visiting, some talking, some light refreshment, and this was where the friendships and the courtships began. It was at one of these singings that I first spoke at length with Martha Lapp, who would become my wife. She was the daughter of Abner Lapp, who farmed about 2 miles north of us, a quiet man of great steadiness whom I had always respected. Martha was 18, a year older than I was, with dark eyes and a way of listening to you when you spoke that made you feel your words were worth the saying. It was simply a growing inclination toward one person, a gradual certainty that this was the person, and I believe she felt the same thing on her side, because we were married 3 years later when I was 20, and we were married for 56 years, until she died, and I have never for a moment doubted that she was the right choice and I was right for her. I will not try to describe what began to happen in those evenings because it was not anything dramatic, nothing that needed describing with large gestures. Courting in our community was done in a particular way. You did not, as they do in the outside world, make a great public display of it. A young man would make his interest known quietly, discreetly through the established channels, and if the young woman was agreeable, visiting would begin. He would come on Sunday evenings after the family had gone to bed and sit with her in the parlor or the kitchen, talking quietly, getting to know each other in the honest way that you get to know someone when you are sitting across from them in a lamplit room and the rest of the house is asleep. There is a kind of seriousness to courting done this way that I think is good, that strips away the performances and the showing off that can happen in other settings and leaves just two people discovering whether they are suited. Martha and I discovered that we were. Our conversations in those evenings ranged over many things: the farm, the faith, what we hoped for in the life ahead, our families, our memories of childhood. She was thoughtful and plain-spoken and could make me laugh with a single quiet observation, and that was a quality I valued greatly. She was also a fine cook, though I would not have mentioned this as a reason for marrying her, but I noticed it at the meals I took with her family. Noticed the bread she had made and the quality of the pie she had put on the table, and I will say that these were not irrelevant. We were married in November, as was common, after the harvest was in and before the hard winter set in. A wedding in our community was a large occasion, though not elaborate, and it was held at the bride's family's home. Martha's father had a large farm, and the house was opened up and the community gathered, perhaps 150 people, the men and women sitting in their separate sections for the long service, and then the great dinner afterward, and then more visiting, and then the young people's supper in the evening. The food was enormous in its abundance. Martha had told me that her mother and her aunts had been cooking for days, and I believed it. There were roasted chickens and ducks and stuffing and mashed potatoes and creamed celery, which is a traditional wedding dish and one I still think about with pleasure, and many kinds of pickles and relishes and breads and pies. The cream pies in particular. After the wedding we moved into the farmhouse that had been my grandparents' and that my father had kept for me, having no need of it since my grandparents had passed. It was a smaller house than the one I grew up in, but solid and good, with a fine kitchen and a garden that needed some attention, and a barn that needed a new roof on the west end. The first year was a year of settling in, of establishing the routines of a shared household, of learning to be a couple in the daily practical sense of the word, which is the real sense. Martha kept the house beautifully, and the garden was hers, and she made it productive in the first season, planting with the same generosity my mother had, rows of beans and tomatoes and peas and herbs. The first time she baked bread in our kitchen, the house smelled exactly as my mother's house had smelled, and I stood in the doorway of the kitchen watching her work and felt, in a way I could not quite have named, that everything was continuing as it should. We had children, 6 of them over the years, and they grew up on the same farm, learning the same things, following the same seasons. I will not try to tell all of that now, there is too much of it, and I am growing peaceful here in my chair, the way one does in the evening, and I want to linger on these older memories a little longer. On the feel of those early years. There was a barn raising in those early years of my marriage that I want to tell about because it stays with me as one of the best days I can remember. My neighbor, Ellie Zook, had lost his barn to a lightning strike in July. The hay in the mow had caught and the barn had gone quickly, and only the grace of God and the fast work of many neighbors had prevented the fire from reaching the house. Ellie lost everything in the barn, the equipment, the stored hay, some of the tools, though the animals were gotten out safely. The community decided to raise a new barn before the summer was out, before the hay season ended. I was there with my father and my brother, and I can see it still, the frame going up, timber by timber, the great bent sections raised by hand on ropes and pipe poles, the men working in teams, the sounds of hammers and saws and men calling to one another, and by afternoon the skeleton of the barn standing complete against the sky, and by evening the roof sheathed and the building closed in enough that it would serve. The women worked as hard as the men that day, feeding everyone, and the food came in enormous quantities, brought in wagons and in baskets, great trays of meat and bread and vegetables and cakes and pies, and at midday everyone stopped and ate together in the yard. All 60 men, and the women and children too, sitting in the grass or on planks laid across sawhorses for tables. A date was set, and word went through the district, and men came from 5 miles around, carpenters and farmers and older men and young men, barely grown, and they came with tools and with willingness. And there were perhaps 60 men on that day, working from first light until the sun began to go down. Ellie sat with us, quiet and grateful, and I remember him saying only quietly that he did not know how to thank anyone, and one of the older men said simply that no thanks were needed, and that was that, and everyone went back to work. That is what community means, not a sentiment, not a word you say. It is what people do when something is needed. I am old enough now that many of the people I have been speaking of are gone. My father and my mother, both gone in their 80s, peacefully. My brothers, most of them. My sister Anna, who was the most musical of us all and whose singing voice was pure and clear and who could lead a hymn so that even the uncertain voices found their way. Martha, my wife, who left me 11 years ago now, quietly in the night, in her sleep, which was the way she would have wanted it, without trouble. I miss her in a way that has no good description, the way you miss your right hand, perhaps. It is not grief, exactly. Not anymore. It is more like an awareness of absence that is simply part of how things are. But I am not sad tonight. I am sitting here watching the last of the light go, and I am grateful, and that is the right word for it. Grateful for the long years and the full life and the work that was always honest and the faith that was always there, steady as the ground under the plow. The sky is darkening now over the elm trees, the last orange fading out of it, and the first stars are showing. I can see 2 of them from here. Very bright, very still. The crickets are loud now, a great waving sound of them rising and falling a little in the warm air, and somewhere in the fields across the road there is a bullfrog going in the low, repeated voice that bullfrogs have. There was an orchard on my father's farm, 12 trees of different kinds, planted by my grandfather before my father was born, and by the time I was a boy those trees were large and generous and in good apple years produced more apples than we could use, which meant there was apple butter to make and cider to press and dried apples to put up and still plenty to give away and sell. These sounds have been in this place for as long as I can remember, perhaps for as long as people have been here, and they will be here long after I have gone, and that thought does not trouble me. It is a comforting thought. It means the world continues in its way. I want to tell about the apple harvest before I get too drowsy to tell it right. The apple harvest came in September, the earliest apples coming first while the nights were still warm, and the late keepers coming last, some of them not ready until October. We shook the trees and picked up the windfalls and picked the ones that were right by hand, carrying them in bushel baskets to the press. The cider press was in the barn, and pressing cider was one of the tasks I loved the most, turning the screw down on the rack of pomace, the cider running sweet and fragrant into the bucket below, the smell of it filling the barn. The applesauce went in first, and then you cooked it down and down, stirring constantly with a long wooden paddle, because if you stopped stirring it burned, and the stir had to go all the way to the bottom and around the edges, and the day was long and the fire had to be kept just right, and you spelled each other at the stirring so no one person had to do it the whole time. As the day went on, the apple butter thickened and darkened, and the spices went in, cinnamon and cloves, and the smell of it over the fire was so good that it drew people from the road sometimes, strangers who slowed their horses to see what was going on, and if they stopped, my mother would offer them a taste on a piece of bread, and they were always glad of it. Fresh cider has a particular smell, sweet and slightly wild, and it foams a little in the bucket when it is fresh, and the color of it is a warm tawny gold. The apple butter was made outdoors in a large copper kettle over an open fire, and it took all day. The finished apple butter was poured into crocks and capped and put in the cellar, and we ate it all winter on bread and on pancakes and on biscuits, and it lasted until spring if we were careful with it, and sometimes just barely past spring, and then the waiting for the new apple season began again. I should mention the Sabbath, the Sunday rest, more fully, because it was the heart of the week in a way that I want to do justice to. Saturday was the day of preparation, the house cleaned, the cooking done, that could be done ahead, the animals seen to in a particular way so that Sunday's chores would be as light as possible. And then Sunday itself was truly different from the other days, not just in the church service, but in the whole quality of it. After church and the noon meal there was visiting and rest, and the afternoon had an unhurried, expansive feeling to it, a feeling of time that was not divided up for tasks, that was simply time, open and available. My father would sometimes walk the fields on a Sunday afternoon, slowly, not working, but looking, seeing how things were coming on, how the corn was doing, where the drainage had been good and where it needed attention, and sometimes I walked with him. He did not talk much on these walks, but he saw everything, and sometimes he would stop and stand a moment looking at a row of corn or a corner of the wheat field and make a small sound of either approval or mild concern, and I would look where he was looking and try to understand what he saw. It was one of the ways I learned to read a growing thing, to see what a healthy plant looked like and to notice the difference when something was not quite right. The faith was never separate from any of this. It was not a thing we did on Sundays and set aside during the week. It was in the work and in the rest and in the relationships with neighbors and in the care we took with animals and with the earth. When my father walked those fields on Sunday afternoon and saw that his corn was healthy and his drainage was sound, he gave thanks in a simple and practical way, a nod toward what was good. When things went wrong, a crop damaged by hail, an animal lost, a hard winter that cost us more than we could easily spare, there was not much complaint. There was a settling into what was, and a trust that what was what was meant to be, and that the next season would come. I am not saying we were never disappointed or tired or discouraged. I am saying we did not find it useful to dwell in those states. There was too much to do, and the work itself was often the remedy. When you are behind the plow in a good field in spring, there is not much room for the kind of dark thinking that can take hold of a person who has too much idle time. The body is engaged and the attention is required, and the progress of the furrow is there to see, and when you turn at the end of the row and look back at what has been done, there is a satisfaction that is immediate and real and does not need anything added to it. Let me say something about the market. The ride to Lancaster in the wagon took the better part of 2 hours, the horse moving steadily on the road, my father holding the lines loosely and sometimes talking to me and sometimes quiet, and in the early morning the countryside had a particular freshness to it. The dew still on everything, the light coming up slowly, the birds of morning going through their varied calls in the trees along the road. My father went to market every week in the good seasons to Lancaster City, loading the wagon the day before, the produce and the eggs and sometimes butter and cheese, and leaving very early in the morning before light to arrive when the market opened. I went with him sometimes, beginning when I was perhaps 8 or 9. The English customers came and the Amish sellers stood at their stalls or wagons, and there was a particular way of talking that happened there, a kind of plain-spoken transaction that satisfied both parties, and my father was good at it, knowing the value of what he had and asking it without apology and giving it without delay once the price was agreed. The market itself was a wonder to me as a boy, So many people, so much noise, so many smells, the vegetables and the flowers, the baked goods and the meats, the animals sold in a separate pen, the whole press and movement of it. He treated every customer with the same straightforward courtesy, whether they were buying 1 dozen eggs or a whole bushel of tomatoes. We ate something from one of the market stalls at midday, and this was a small luxury, something not made at home, perhaps a sausage on a roll or piece of soft pretzel, and I remember how good it tasted, how the simple pleasure of food eaten in the middle of a busy morning in a crowd of strangers had its own particular flavor. Then the business done and the wagon considerably lighter. The long ride home in the afternoon, the horse knowing the way so well he hardly needed direction, and me often drowsing against my father's shoulder before we were halfway home. Those Saturday market days had a completeness to them, a narrative shape, the early start, the busy middle, the easy return, that I have always liked to think about. I want to say something now about the winters as a young man. The winters when the farm was more quiet and the days were short, and there was a different kind of work to do. The indoor work, the work of maintaining and repairing that accumulated during the busy seasons. My father sharpened tools, mended harness, worked on the wagon, fixed things that had been waiting for fixing since summer. I was beside him at the workbench in the barn, learning these skills the way I had learned all the farm skills, by watching and then trying and being corrected gently when I was wrong. The barn in winter had its own character. The horses and cattle were all in, the hay and the mow giving off their faint warmth, and the smell was concentrated, all those animals close together, the hay, the manure on the straw in the stalls, the oats in the bin. In the evening when the lantern hung from its hook on the center beam, the shadows were large and deep in the corners, and the animals moved in the half-dark with slow, placid movements, the cattle chewing steadily, the horses standing at their ease. I've always found the sound of cattle chewing in a quiet barn to be one of the most peaceful sounds I know. It is a sound of contentment and of plenty, of a creature entirely satisfied with what it has. My mother had her winter work too, the spinning and the sewing that could not be properly attended to in the busy seasons. She had a spinning wheel, though by my time most of the wool was taken to be processed at the mill and returned as yarn or cloth. But she sewed constantly, making clothes for the children, patching and remaking as things wore out, quilting in the evenings. She was part of a quilting group that met on winter afternoons, the women rotating through each other's homes, sitting around a large frame and quilting together, talking as they worked, and I think those afternoons were important to them in a way that was not only about the quilts. The quilts themselves were beautiful, made in the traditional patterns. Double wedding ring. Log cabin. 9-patch. Bear's paw. The colors were the solid colors our people use, the deep blues and greens and purples and dark reds, no printed fabrics, nothing showy, but the patterns made from those solid colors had their own beauty, a beauty of geometry and of the careful placement of color. A well-made Amish quilt is a kind of argument in fabric, an argument for attention and order and the value of taking care. I am thinking now of the summer evenings of my first years of marriage, when Martha and I would sit on our porch after the children were in bed, in the warm dark, listening to the sounds of the farm at rest, the horses in the barn making their small sounds, the dogs settling in the yard, the calls of the nighthawks overhead, those birds that fly in the last light and make that odd booming sound that always seemed to me the voice of summer evening itself. Martha would have her mending sometimes, and I would have nothing. Just the evening, and we would talk or not talk, and it was one of the good things, one of the reliable good things, year after year. We grew older together the way people do, gradually and without particular notice, until one day you look at the person you married and see that they have gray in their hair and that their movements are a little slower, and then you realize you must look the same to them, and it is not a sad realization. It is the realization that time has passed in the way time is meant to pass, steadily and full of days, and that the years have held more good than ill, more work that satisfied than work that depleted, more community than loneliness, more faith than doubt. The children grew and married and brought their own children to the farm for Sundays and holidays, and the house that had been quiet when just Martha and I were in it filled again with the noise and movement of the young, which was both lovely and a little exhausting. And I say the second part with affection. My grandchildren learned to call the horses and to carry the eggs and to help in the garden, the same tasks I had learned at their ages, and watching them do it was one of the quieter pleasures of those years. I have lived long enough to see many things change in the world outside our community. I have watched from this porch as the roads have filled with automobiles and the power lines have gone up along the county roads and the farms around us have been sold and divided and built upon in ways that my grandfather would not recognize. The world moves fast now, faster than I think is good for it, faster than I think is good for it, faster than I think is good for people. I do not say this with bitterness. I say it with the simple observation of a man who has lived slowly and found slowness to be very full of good things. Our community has changed too, in smaller ways. There are some things done differently than when I was young, some accommodations made, some lines moved slightly as communities do over time as they navigate what is essential and what is not. The core has held. The faith, the community, the simplicity, the ordnung that gives our life its shape, these have held. I am glad of it. I believe they will continue to hold. The stars are very clear tonight. I can see a great many of them now, the sky having fully darkened, and the moon has not yet risen, so the stars have the sky to themselves, as they should. The milky band of them across the middle of the sky is visible, as it is on clear nights this time of year. A faint luminosity, thousands upon thousands of lights so far away that the light we see left them before any of us were born, before our grandparents were born, before the first of our people made the crossing to this country. That is a thought that could make a person feel very small, and I suppose in one sense it should, but the feeling it gives me is not smallness. It is something more like belonging. We are small, yes, but we are part of something very large. There is a whippoorwill somewhere in the trees beyond the south field. I can hear it now, the clear three-note call it makes over and over in the summer night. Whip poor Will, one of the most particular sounds of the Pennsylvania dark. I have heard that call 10,000 summer evenings. It is one of the sounds of home. My knees are telling me it is nearly time to go in. Old knees have their opinions, and I have learned to respect them, as I have learned to respect all the signals the body sends when it has been used for 83 years. But I am in no hurry yet. The air is very pleasant, that warm nighttime air of summer with just the beginning of a coolness in it that tells you the season is thinking about turning a few weeks from now into the early quiet of fall. I love the early fall. I have always loved it. The mornings getting cool and crisp, the air having a clarity it loses in the heat of summer, the light going golden, the harvests coming in. There will be another harvest. This farm is my son's farm now, has been for many years, and he tends it well, and in the fall the corn will come in and the potatoes will come in and the apples on the trees my grandfather planted, not my grandfather. I should say, I have lost track, will be ready for the pressing and the apple butter and the sweet smell of cider that means autumn in this place. And I will sit here on this porch and watch it happen and be glad of it. That is my work now. Watching and being glad of it. That is my work now. Watching and being glad. I have told you a great deal tonight sitting here, about the horses and the barn and the bread and the butter and the hay and the apple butter and the threshing and the froushing and the plowing and the school and the singings and Martha and the children and the years. I have told it without order, the way memories come, not in a line but in layers, one thing leading to another, the smell of fresh bread leading to my mother's kitchen, leading to the lamp on the table, leading to the sound of my father's voice reading in the evening. This is how a life feels from the inside of it. I think, not a story with a clear beginning and middle and end, but a collection of mornings and evenings, of meals eaten and fields walked and hands held and prayers said and songs sung, and underneath it all, a continuity, a thread that runs from the very beginning to right now, to this moment on this porch in this evening air, and that thread is made of the same thing all the way through, not a sequence but a texture. Faith and family and work and place, these four things, they are enough. They have always been enough. The porch boards are cool under my feet now, the wood having let go of the day's warmth. The lamp is lit inside the house. My daughter-in-law has put it on. I can see its glow through the window, waiting for me to come in. She is a good woman. My son chose well. I will go in soon. I will have a cup of tea and perhaps read a little from the Psalms, which are the right reading for an old man in the evening, full of the right things, gratitude and humility and the recognition that the world is very large and we are small within it but not forgotten within it. And then I will sleep, as I sleep every night without much difficulty, the sleep of a man whose days have been full, whose conscience is at rest, whose body knows what it is to have worked and earned its night. The whippoorwill is still calling in the trees. The crickets are steady and untroubled. The stars are out in their vast and patient numbers. The fields lie dark and at rest beyond the fence, holding the seeds of what will come, as fields always do, as they have always done, as long as there have been men and women willing to tend them and to trust the turning of the seasons. I am grateful for all of it, for the long summer days and the deep winter evenings and the smell of hay and the sound of horses and the taste of bread just from the oven and the voices singing old hymns slowly in a barn that has been opened up for worship. For Martha's hand in mine, for my children's voices in this house, for the work that wore me down in the good way and built me back up, for the faith that held when nothing else would have. I am grateful for the slow life, the unhurried, careful, ordinary life. It has been a very full thing. Good night now. The lamp is waiting and the psalms are there, and the night is a good one, warm and clear and full of the sounds of the living world going on about its business in the dark.